I didn't find out the way fathers are supposed to find out. There was no phone call, no dinner where he cleared his throat and said he had something to tell me. No text message, even. Nothing. I found out the way the rest of the world found out, scrolling through Facebook on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee going cold on my desk. The post was from his wife's account, a woman I had never met, a woman whose last name my son had apparently taken on as a hyphenate without thinking to mention it to me. She had posted a wedding album, 47 photos, the kind with the golden hour lighting and the flower arrangements that cost more than my first truck. There was my son, Marcus, in a charcoal suit I didn't recognize, laughing at something off camera. There was the first dance, the cake cutting, the toasts. Someone had released white doves. There were photos of the rehearsal dinner, photos of the morning getting ready, photos of people I had never seen before, draped over each other like old friends. And there, in the caption, were the words that I read 3 times before they settled in my chest like something heavy and permanent. Grateful for the man who made all of this possible. Dad, you gave us everything. We love you. She was talking about her father. He was in the photo beside them, one hand on Marcus's shoulder, beaming. A man named Gerald Whitmore. A man I had spoken to exactly twice in my life. Both times briefly. Both times not knowing who he was or why it mattered. I put my coffee down. I did not cry. I sat there for a long time, very still, the way I used to go still on job sites, when something structural was wrong, when a wall wasn't plumb, when a load-bearing beam had been compromised. You stop. You look. You calculate what's going to fall and when. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. Let me back up, because you need to understand who I am and what I built, or none of what comes next will make any sense. My name is Walter Greer. I am 63 years old. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house with drafty windows and a furnace that quit every February. My father worked at a tool and die shop for 31 years and retired with a bad back and a watch. My mother cleaned houses on the weekends. We were not poor exactly, but we knew what poor looked like, and it lived close enough to smell. I didn't go to college. I got a job swinging a hammer at 19, and I was good at it. By 26, I had my contractor's license. By 32, Greer Construction had 6 employees and a reputation in Central Ohio for finishing on time and on budget. By the time Marcus was in high school, I had 43 employees, 3 active commercial projects, and a piece of land outside Columbus that I'd bought at auction for 30 cents on the dollar and turned into a small industrial park, 8 units, all leased, all profitable. I built that. I built it the way my father built everything, carefully, slowly, without shortcuts, without anyone handing me anything I hadn't earned twice over. My wife, Carolyn, died when Marcus was 20, pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She was 51 years old, and she was the best person I ever knew, and losing her reshaped everything inside me in ways I still don't fully understand. What I do know is that after she was gone, Marcus became the center of whatever was left. Not in a smothering way. I wasn't that kind of father. But in the way that you point everything you have left in one direction, and you try. I tried. I paid for his education without a loan. University of Michigan, business degree, 4 years. He graduated and came to work for me, which I'd hoped for, but never pressured. For a while, it was good. He learned the business. He was smart. He had Carolyn's instincts for people and my instincts for numbers, which was a useful combination. I started to think about the future in a specific way. I started to think about what it would look like to hand something over. Then he met a woman, and everything changed gradually, the way erosion changes a riverbank. You don't notice it day by day. You only notice when the bank is gone. Her name was Danielle Whitmore. I learned this approximately 6 months after Marcus had apparently been seeing her, when he mentioned her name at dinner in the way you mention something you've been sitting on for a while. Casual, careful. I didn't think much of it. He'd dated before. He was 32. It was natural. I met her once, briefly, at a lunch that lasted 40 minutes. She was attractive and polished, and talked more about her family's lake house than she talked about Marcus. I noticed that. I filed it away. Over the next several months, Marcus started coming in late. Not scandalously late 20 minutes here, 30 minutes there. He started canceling the standing Tuesday morning check-ins we'd had for 2 years. He stopped asking questions about the Henderson contract the way he used to, the way someone asks questions when they're invested. He started getting quiet in a way that didn't feel like thinking. It felt like somewhere else. I didn't confront him about it. I'm not a confrontational man by nature. I watched. The way you watch a foundation for settling. You take measurements. You don't panic. What I did notice, about 8 months after Danielle entered the picture, was that Marcus had started talking about starting his own company, a property management firm. He had ideas about it, real ones. He'd done research, put together projections, identified a gap in the market. I respected the ambition. I told him so. What he asked me for was the use of the warehouse unit on the east end of my industrial park. Unit 7. It had been sitting empty for 4 months after a tenant left. He wanted to use it as his office and operations hub while he got the business off the ground. He said he'd pay rent once he was profitable. I said yes. Because I believed in him. Because it was a reasonable ask. Because I was his father. And that's what fathers do when their children show initiative and work ethic. I didn't make him sign a lease. I didn't put a timeline on it. I trusted him. That was my first mistake, and I don't say that bitterly. I say it the way you say any honest thing about yourself, with recognition, without drama. Several months went by. The property management company, which he called Meridian Property Group, was getting some traction. He'd picked up 3 small accounts. He had 2 employees. He was putting in hours. I was glad for him. I kept my distance. It was his business, not mine, and I had no interest in hovering. What I did not know, until much later, was what he had done with my name while I wasn't looking. He had approached a regional bank for a business line of credit, $40,000. The loan officer, who knew me, who had done financing on 2 of my commercial projects, asked Marcus if Walter Greer was involved. Marcus said yes. Marcus said I was a silent partner, an advisor, that the business operated out of my property, which was true, and implied that I was backing the venture in a meaningful financial way, which was not true. The loan officer, who should have called me and did not, approved the line of credit based heavily on the association with my name and my track record. I did not know this had happened. I also did not know that Marcus, at some point in those months, had been telling people in his new social circle, Danielle's circle, really, the Whitmore family's circle, that her father Gerald was his mentor. His business mentor, that Gerald had connected him with vendors and clients and offered advice that shaped the company. That Gerald's network was responsible for Meridian's early success. Gerald Whitmore, from what I later gathered, was a semi-retired financial advisor with a membership at a golf club and a lot of friends who owned things. He had connected Marcus with a few people. That was real, but Marcus had started crediting him in ways that expanded well beyond golf course introductions. In the version of the story Marcus told at dinner parties and networking events, Gerald was the patriarch who had believed in him, who had given him a real start. I was not in that story. Or if I was in the background, the empty warehouse, the quiet investor who wasn't really involved. I did not know any of this on that Tuesday morning when I sat at my desk with a cold cup of coffee and 47 wedding photos loading on my phone. What I knew was this: my son had gotten married. He had done it without telling me. He had done it, and this was the part I kept returning to, the part that wouldn't settle in a way that was deliberate. You don't forget to tell your father you're getting married. You don't accidentally omit the invitation. You make a choice. Marcus had made a choice about what kind of family he was stepping into and what kind of family he was stepping away from. I thought about Carolyn. I thought about how she would have wanted to see him in that charcoal suit, how she would have cried the good kind of crying and then pretended she hadn't. I thought about the fact that her only child had gotten married and released white doves, and she wasn't there, and neither was I, and the man in the photo with his hand on my son's shoulder was Gerald Whitmore. I put the phone down. I sat very still, and then I began to think clearly, the way I always think clearly when something structural is wrong. I called my attorney, Philip Nakamura, at 8:47 in the morning. I had worked with Philip for 19 years. He knew my business, my properties, my trust documents, everything. When he answered, I didn't spend much time on preamble. I said, Marcus got married. I found out this morning from Facebook. I need you to walk me through everything that has my name on it and everything that has his name on it and everything in between. Philip was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Give me 2 hours. I used those 2 hours to look up Gerald Whitmore. He had a LinkedIn page. Most of his recommendations were from Marcus. One of them, written 8 months ago, said, Gerald has been an indispensable force in building Meridian Property Group. His guidance, network, and belief in our vision have been the foundation of what we're building. I don't know where I'd be without him. It had 43 likes. Marcus had not sent me a copy. I looked at the photo again, the caption again. The man who made all of this possible. I am not a man who cries easily. The last time I cried was at Carolyn's funeral. And even then I held it until I was alone in the car, in the parking lot of the funeral home. I didn't cry that morning either. What I felt was something colder and more architectural, like when you realize a wall you built 5 years ago has been quietly holding up something it was never designed to support, and now you have to make a decision about the whole structure. Philip called me back at 11. He had done a thorough pull. What he found, among several other things, was the business line of credit at Regional Commerce Bank, $40,000, drawn down to $31,000, taken out in a way that had leveraged my reputation at the bank without my explicit authorization. Technically, it was Marcus's debt alone, but the way it had been originated involved my name being used in a way I had never agreed to. Can we touch that loan? I asked. Philip said the bank had been careless and that if I contacted them directly to clarify the nature of my involvement, or lack thereof, the terms of the credit line could be revisited, possibly called in. I said, What about Unit 7? He said, Month to month. No lease. You can terminate the occupancy agreement with 30 days written notice. What about the trust? The family trust currently names Marcus as the primary beneficiary of the real estate assets, including the industrial park. You have full authority to amend the distribution at any time while you're living. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, Draft the termination notice for Unit 7. Hold everything else for now. I want to think. What I thought about, for the rest of that week, was not revenge. I want to be clear about that. I have no interest in revenge. Revenge is for people who want the other person to feel something. What I wanted was something different. I wanted my son to understand something that I had apparently failed to teach him, and I had run out of gentle ways to teach it. I thought about the times I had tried, the conversations about self-reliance, about what it meant to build something versus inherit something, about Carolyn's belief, which I shared, that a man who cannot stand on his own cannot be trusted to stand beside anyone else either. I thought about how Marcus had nodded at all of those conversations with the patient expression of a man who was waiting for you to finish so he could go back to what he was doing. I thought about the 43 employees who depended on me to make decisions carefully and without sentiment. I thought about the industrial park, which Carolyn and I had looked at together, which she had said felt like the beginning of something real. I thought about her saying that to me, and I thought about her not being there, and I thought about Marcus releasing white doves with Gerald Whitmore's hand on his shoulder. At the end of that week, I drove to Unit 7. It was a Thursday afternoon. I parked across the street and sat in my truck for a few minutes. Through the glass front of the unit, I could see Marcus at a standing desk, talking on the phone, gesturing the way he does when he's excited about something. One of his employees, a young woman, was working at a computer near the window. The space looked good. He'd done it up right, clean, organized, a small lobby area with the Meridian logo on the wall. He'd done real work in there. I want to acknowledge that because it matters. Whatever else was true, Marcus had used that space and built something with it. That wasn't nothing. I drove away without going in. On Friday morning, I had Philip send the 30-day notice. I drove to Regional Commerce Bank and asked to speak with the branch manager, a man named Kevin Terrace, who I had worked with on the Henderson project financing. I sat across from him and I told him calmly and specifically what had happened. I told him that my son had implied a level of financial involvement from me that did not exist. I told him I had never agreed to act as a backer or silent partner for Meridian Property Group that I had provided a workspace as a courtesy and nothing more. I told him I thought the bank should know this, given how the credit relationship had apparently been characterized during origination. Kevin Terrace's face did a complicated series of things while I was talking. By the end, he looked like a man who had made a mistake and was calculating the cost of it. The bank reviewed the credit line. They sent Marcus a letter the following Tuesday, requesting a formal meeting to discuss the terms of the existing facility. I didn't call Marcus. I knew he would call me. He called me on Wednesday morning. I was on a job site in Dublin when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. I let it ring. I let the next 2 calls ring as well. On the 4th call, I answered, because I'm not a man who hides. He was already in the middle of a sentence when I said hello. Something about the bank. Something about a letter he'd received. His voice had that particular quality it had always had when he was caught between anger and anxiety, a kind of controlled speed, like he was driving too fast and trying to look like he wasn't. I waited until he ran out of words. Then I said, "How's Danielle?" The silence was the longest I'd heard from him in years. I said, "I saw the photos." He said, "Dad?" I said, 47 of them. She posts well. He started to say something about it being complicated, about them wanting something small, about how he'd planned to tell me, about Danielle's family having a tradition of private ceremonies, about how he thought I'd understand. Each sentence came out slightly different, slightly repositioned, the way a structure tries to redistribute load when a support gives way. I said, "Marcus, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." He stopped talking. I said, "Did you tell Kevin Terrace at Regional Commerce that I was financially involved in Meridian?" The pause was shorter this time, which told me he'd been expecting this part. I said you were supportive of the business. That's not what I asked. Another pause. I may have let him assume that your involvement went beyond the warehouse space. May have. Dad, I'm on a job site, I said. I'll be home by 6. If you want to talk, come to the house. He came at 7. He came alone, which surprised me. I'd half expected Gerald Whitmore to appear in the driveway, but it was just Marcus, in jeans and a jacket, looking like a man who hadn't slept well. I let him in, and I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd done homework for 12 years. The same table where Carolyn and I had told him she was sick. He said, "I know this looks bad." I said, "Tell me what it looks like from your side." He told me about how things with Danielle had moved fast and the wedding had come together in a way that was driven by her family's rhythm and expectations, and that there had been a moment where telling me felt like it would complicate things. And then the moment passed, and it seemed easier to just let it happen and tell me after. He told me that he hadn't meant to hurt me, which I believed. He told me that he'd gotten caught up in the world the Whitmore family moved in, and that it had felt good to be seen a certain way by those people, and that Gerald had been genuinely helpful, and he'd wanted to acknowledge that. I listened to all of it. I am a good listener. Carolyn always said that was one of my better qualities. When he was done, I said, "Do you understand what you used my name to do?" He said he understood. It looked like he'd borrowed my reputation. I said, "It doesn't look like that. That's what it is. The bank made a lending decision based on their relationship with me. You didn't lie outright, but you let them believe something that wasn't true. That's the kind of thing that follows a person, that follows a business. Do you understand that?" He said he did. I said, "And the LinkedIn post. Gerald has been the foundation of what we're building. What did he actually do?" Marcus looked at the table. He introduced me to some people, opened some doors. And the warehouse? The roof over your company's head for a year and a half, rent-free? The name on the door that the bank recognized? Where does that show up on your LinkedIn? He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer that worked, and he knew it. I said, "I'm not angry about the wedding because you left me out of a party. I'm angry because of what the choice tells me. You looked at the 2 families in your life, and you decided which one gave you what you wanted to be seen as, and it wasn't this one. That's fine. That's your right. But when you made that choice, you should have understood that it comes with a set of consequences that are equally yours." He said, "I can fix this." I said, "What would fixing it look like, in your mind?" He said he could make a post clarifying things. He could talk to the bank. He could sit down with Gerald and recalibrate the story going forward. He had ideas, all of them aimed at managing the appearance of the problem rather than the root of it. I said, "The notice for Unit 7 stands. 30 days. The expression on his face shifted. He said, "Dad, I have employees. I know you do. If I lose that space, the overhead of finding something comparable, with the credit situation at the bank right now." I said, "Yes, that's going to be hard. I know that. You're going to let my business fail over this?" I said, "No. Your business won't fail unless you let it. But I'm not going to let it operate out of my building as if nothing happened. That's not a punishment. That's just a natural consequence of what's changed between us." He said, "What's changed?" "I got married without inviting you. That's what this is about." I looked at him for a long moment. He was 34 years old, and he looked a lot like Carolyn around the eyes, and absolutely nothing like her in that moment. I said, "Your mother worked 2 jobs the year I started the company. She drove a '94 Corolla with no air conditioning for 3 summers because we needed the capital on the balance sheet, not in the car payment. She never complained once. Not one time. You know why?" He waited. "Because we were building something together, and she understood that what you build is worth more than what you're given. That's what I wanted to teach you. That's what I spent the last 10 years trying to show you. And what I learned from those LinkedIn posts and from those 47 photos is that somewhere along the way, you decided it was more important to be seen as the kind of man who was given things than to be the kind of man who built them." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a neighbor was mowing a lawn somewhere down the block. That distant sound of an engine in the evening. Marcus said, "That's not fair." I said, "Maybe not, but it's what I observed." He sat with that. Then he said, quietly, "What do I do about the bank?" I said, "That's your problem to solve. And I mean that the way I mean it when I say it to anyone who works for me. I believe you can solve it, or I wouldn't say it." He left at 9. He didn't slam the door. He was never a door slammer, even as a teenager. He closed it carefully, the way he'd always done, which for some reason was harder to watch than if he'd slammed it. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after he left. The coffee was cold. I thought about whether I had been too hard, and I decided I had been exactly hard enough, which is a different thing. Too hard would have been to call the bank before I talked to him. Too hard would have been to change the trust without warning. What I had done was remove a foundation that had been misrepresented and let him feel the load it had been carrying. That's not cruelty. That's engineering. The next few weeks were not quiet. Gerald Whitmore called me. I didn't know how he'd gotten my number, and when I asked him, he said Danielle had found it. He was cordial in the way that men from golf clubs are cordial, expansive, and warm in a way that's designed to make you feel like you're unreasonable if you're not warm back. He said he hoped we could meet. He said he felt terrible about the situation with the wedding, that it had been poorly handled, that Danielle and Marcus had made decisions in a kind of bubble, and he wished someone had stepped in sooner. He said he hoped there was a way forward that worked for everyone. I said, "I appreciate the call, Gerald. I don't have anything against you personally." He said he was glad to hear that. He said he wanted me to know that he'd been happy to help Marcus because he saw real talent there, and that he hoped I didn't feel like he'd overstepped. I said, "What Marcus needs right now is to learn that he can handle a hard situation. I think you know that. I think that's why you're calling me, instead of just solving the problem for him." Gerald was quiet for a second. Then he said, "You might be right about that." I said, "Let him find his own office space. Let him go back to the bank with a clear account of what his business actually is and what mine is. Let him do the work. He's good enough to do it." Gerald said, "Yes, he is." That was the end of the call. I thought better of Gerald Whitmore after it. Marcus found a space in an office park in Westerville. It cost him more than the warehouse had, which meant he had to renegotiate with one of his vendors and take on a smaller account than he'd been hoping for. He had a difficult conversation with the bank, from which he emerged with a restructured credit line at less favorable terms, which he told me about in a text message, not a phone call. I wrote back, "Good, you handled it." He didn't respond to that. Danielle called me once, about 3 weeks after Marcus's visit. She was polite and measured, and I could tell she was nervous. She said she owed me an apology and that she had convinced herself that Marcus's family situation was simpler than it was, and that she hadn't pushed hard enough to make sure I was included in things that I should have been included in. I said, "I appreciate you calling." She said, "I'd like to know you, if that's possible." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "Come to dinner, both of you, Sunday." There was a pause that I think was her composing herself. She said, "We'll be there." I spent most of Sunday afternoon cooking. I made the pot roast that Carolyn used to make, with the carrots and the rosemary, and the bread that takes 4 hours, but is worth it. I set the table the way we'd always set it for company, the good plates, the cloth napkins, the candles that Carolyn liked. I put a photo of her on the sideboard, where it always sits, so that she was in the room the way she's always in the room. They came at 6. Danielle brought wine, a good bottle, which told me someone had thought about it. She was more nervous in person than she'd been on the phone and less polished, which made me like her more. Marcus was quiet, in a way that was different from his usual quiet. This one had texture to it. He kept glancing at things in the room, the photo of Carolyn, the tools hanging on the wall of the garage visible through the kitchen window, the table he'd eaten at his whole life. After dinner, after Danielle had excused herself to help clean up, and Marcus and I were sitting with the remaining wine in the living room, he said, "I know I haven't said this right yet." I said, "There's no deadline." He said, "I want to say it anyway." He turned the wine glass in his hands, not drinking it. I think I convinced myself that moving towards something new meant I had to minimize where I came from, or who. And that was wrong. That was... He stopped. Started again. I think I was trying to prove something to people who had nothing to do with what I actually am. And I did it in a way that cost you, and she wasn't there. He glanced at the photo on the sideboard. Neither were you, at my wedding. And that's something I have to live with. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "You're going to have children someday." He looked up. I said, "And when you do, you're going to understand something about this that you can't understand yet. Not because you're not smart enough, just because you haven't been there." I looked at the photo too. Teach them to build things, not to inherit things, not to be handed things, to build. That's all I ever wanted to show you. That's the only thing worth passing on. He nodded. It was a different kind of nod than the patient ones I'd described before. This one had some weight behind it. I said, "The trust stands the way it is. The industrial park will come to you when I'm gone. I didn't change any of that. I want you to know that." He said, "Dad," I said, "it was never about the money or the building. I need you to understand that." He did. I could see that he did, or at least that he was beginning to, which is all you can really ask of any person on any given evening. Danielle came back from the kitchen, and she asked if she could see pictures of when Marcus was young. And I said yes, and I got out the albums that I keep in the cabinet under the television, the ones that go back to when Marcus was a baby, and Carolyn was 30, and I was 31, and we had no idea what we were building, or how long we'd have to build it together. We sat there until almost 10 o'clock. Danielle laughed at a photo of Marcus in a Halloween costume, age 4, a lobster suit that Carolyn had made from scratch. She touched the photo carefully, with one finger, and I thought that was a decent sign. When they left, I walked them out to the car. The night was clear and cold the way Ohio gets in early spring when winter hasn't quite made up its mind. Marcus hugged me at the door of the car, and it wasn't the careful hug of a man performing reconciliation. It was his weight, actually leaning in, the way he used to hug me when he was a kid and he'd had a bad day and he didn't want to say so. I stood in the driveway after they pulled out, and I looked up at the sky for a moment. I thought about Carolyn. I thought about the '94 Corolla with no air conditioning. I thought about 43 employees and the Henderson contract and a piece of land I'd bought for 30 cents on the dollar and turned into something that would outlast me. I thought about what it means to hand something down properly, not just to give it, to hand it down in a way that the person receiving it understands what it cost and chooses to be worthy of it. That's the only inheritance that means anything. The rest is just paperwork. I went inside. I washed the good plates by hand, the way Carolyn always insisted on, the way I've done it ever since she showed me how. I put them away carefully. I turned off the lights. The photo on the sideboard was the last thing I saw before I went to bed. She was smiling in it the way she smiled when she thought something was quietly funny, not a big smile, just the corner of the mouth, like she was keeping something to herself. I had always thought it was the best photo of her. I still think so. The following Monday, Marcus called me. Not a text, a call. He had a question about a vendor contract, a real question, the kind you ask when you're actually trying to learn something. We talked for 40 minutes. At the end, he said he'd let me know how it went. I said, I know you will. I went back to work. The Hargrove project was behind schedule, and the subcontractor was giving me grief about the steel delivery, and there was a code issue on the Bexley renovation that needed sorting. There was always something that needed sorting. That's the thing about building. It never stops requiring your attention. You never get to put it down and walk away, and come back to find it the same as you left it. You have to keep working at it, every single day. I've always thought that was a feature, not a flaw.